There we are, that's me. I work for the Migrants' Rights Network. It's an NGO that it's a loose network of migrant and refugee stakeholders like unions, academics, trade unions, academics, voluntary community groups, activists, and we try to promote the rights of migrants in this particularly difficult context that we have seen over the last few years, and it seems to be getting worse. So how did we get here? I moved in the UK back in late 1980s, and London at the time was relatively grey, not a very friendly place. Sorry for my British business. And what has changed it and made it into a real global city and has transformed it into this economic power that compares to New York and other big cities like Hong Kong, and is really, a lot of it is very linked to the free movement of people as well as all the other freedoms within the EU. But one key aspect of this this success of London being this international and what's the term? A sort of it'll come to me, apologies, is because of this cultural diversity and not only the economic success, but it's also down to the cultural diversity, the different communities that coexist, the different foods that you can find. You know, back in '87 you couldn't even find a decent cup of coffee, let alone all these different, seriously delicious foods that you find now from all parts of the globe. So parallel to this, and I think, and that's a personal observation, unlike my fellow speakers, my evidence is based on secondary data that I haven't done the research myself. But the way I kind of feel about why some of these developments are taking place and how this Immigration Act logic, which is basically to make the UK a hostile environment so that, increase hardship for undocumented, normally called illegal migrants. This is not a term that we use in our world. It's undocumented or irregular migrants, which are basically forcing them to destitution in order to persuade them to leave the country, and so that there is less of a pull factor, which is what you were talking about. A lot of the Bangladeshi communities were thinking, they would see London as this place, a desirable place to arrive, where money is plenty. That's not the reality. It has never been the reality, particularly for migrant and refugee groups and ethnic minorities altogether. British citizens who come from a black and ethnic minority background, they don't seem to enjoy the same, the wealthy experience that others have in London. In fact, only 1% in the global world kind of experience. I mean, it's kind of interesting, I think personally, the economic downturn and the global meltdown and the liberal policies which kind of divided communities and made this huge gap between wealth and poverty, which has increased by, I think, a good way of for policymakers, ambitious politicians and, media tycoons that have a different agenda, was to kind of play people of, different communities against each other, in my view. So, you're all familiar with the sensationalist tabloid coverage of, the migrants who are coming here, taking our jobs, using our public services, they're not paying in. None of this is true, because if you're a newcomer and you have to pay for the health service, you can't access benefits without having become a British citizen. So what they managed to do is to increase xenophobia. We've seen a normalization of racism. Anyone now can come out and say whatever they think. You know, if you sound and look different, you have to go back to your place. It doesn't matter if you're second generation, if you're a British citizen who's been here, you know, for a number of generations. You know, if you look different, people can just stop you on the street nowadays and tell you to go back to where. The recent legislation, it started, I think from 1997. There's a number of restrictive immigration legislation, and it's kind of linked with the European, I think, I haven't really prepared this, but you know, the European policy, particularly the northern countries, fearful of immigration that was coming through the South Europe, through the sea, that it was impossible, introduced the Dublin II and the Dublin Agreement, which kind of, you know, stopped people from entering EU borders in the south, which are very difficult to police, and then, you know, seeking sanctuary and asylum in other kind of, you know, aiming to come to the north of Europe, which is more affluent. So I think the restrictive immigration policies in some ways mirror, in the UK, mirror what was happening in the rest of Europe. You know, a lot of the people like CMRB, other NGOs and all sorts of other rights groups and stakeholders were concerned that the effects of the measures that would be decisive and damaging for most of the communities, not just the migrants and refugees. We were concerned that, you know, vulnerable and exploited and destitute people would be criminalized and victimized further. We were worried that ethnic minorities would be targeted, and that the increasing powers that Home Office enforcement officials have acquired as a result of the two acts, particularly the Immigration Act 2016, would be abused. And this is exactly what is happening. Even though it's early days to, you know, to kind of access data, because the Home Office doesn't necessarily need to publish its failed attempts, all they have to publish is what they have accumulated. So, for example, if they do raids, so up until recently, the illegal working was the main activity of immigration enforcement. So this is how they would kind of pick people up, you know. But as the immigration controls have now extended to all other spheres, like, you know, employers, landlords, health providers, educators, it's been happening for a while anyway, with employers and educators. But now there are new requirements for landlords and health providers, as well as banks and driving licenses. So I'm just going to go to some I'm just going to go to the employment legislation. So my organization, we asked through any Freedom of Information request, we asked the Home Office to tell us about the raids that they did from April 2000 to March 2016. So from 2013 to March 2016. Now, we've produced a map of these enforcement raids across London, and it kind of shows a really interesting picture. It's not published yet, as it's work in progress. But we found out that, and again, you know, as I say, the data they released was only of business raids that actually found irregular migrants. They raided 610 small ethnic businesses. The total amount of fines was 9,144,000, which started from 2,500 and it went up to 180,000 for one restaurant in Southwark, a Chinese restaurant. The majority, well, about 24% was served with a 10K fine, and then so that's kind of relates to the Act 2014 imposed a civil penalty of 10,000 per migrant. That has increased to 20,000 now. So the Immigration Act 2016 has brought into force a new requirement to pay 20,000 per irregular person that they find. However, I don't know how many, are you familiar with the Byron Burger case? Okay, so the Byron Burger case. So the Byron Burgers are a chain, a national chain of hamburger places, and they collaborated with the Home Office and set up its workforce. And we know that this is the case because actually, you know, the human resources is outsourced to a management company, sort of, you know, an HR company separate from them. Because initially how it was presented is that, oh, we had a meeting and then the Home Office we had a staff meeting and then the Home Office turned up, which is not the case. And it kind of caused huge outrage by the public, lots of boycott actions, which kind of brought to the force the conversation around, you know, what are the ethical responsibilities that employers have, and what are the legal requirements for employers. So, for example, if you're an employer, you don't have to reveal all your information and your staff to the Home Office. If you have taken reasonable if you can prove that you have followed a reasonable course to identify the status of your workforce, you don't have to reveal anything else. That's enough. You know, you're not going to be found guilty if you're taken to court. But that's not the case. You know, a lot of big companies, particularly big companies, and this is what we were concerned, that vulnerable communities would be targeted. So small Black and ethnic minority businesses that don't have huge HR offices to support them, they might not run the right checks. Sometimes I think it's quite difficult. If you're a restaurant, you'll see why, because of these 680 small businesses, 57% are restaurants and takeaways. These people can't afford to hire HR consultants to kind of run through those things. And it's quite interesting, you know, 27% were of Indian origin of those businesses, 24 were Pakistani restaurants, 7% were Bangladeshi, and 5% were Chinese. And then, you know, there was other Asian and African businesses, primarily, as I said, restaurants and takeaways, 24% retail, and beauty shops, and then some cleaning services or construction companies were also raided. So in 2013, there was an 18.5% of those 610, 18.5% took place in 2013, 40% took place in 2014, which was when the new act was introduced. And it kind of shows a pattern here which plays into all the political rhetoric of, you know, we are going to have a tough immigration system so that we, you know, we're taking back control, and all of those things play. So again, if you look at the breakdown of which boroughs are targeted and which, you know, 7% is Croydon. All these are around, all the boroughs start from 7% to about 5%. So it's kind of evenly. So in Croydon, you know, the majority of, most of these areas have large populations of a Black and ethnic minority origin. Ealing, you know, Southall, Newham, Brent, and I use the term Black and ethnic minority in the political sense because, for example, Newham is not you know, they're not the minority there of the population, they are the majority, but that's the... So if you look at those areas, you'll see where there's concentrated ethnic, you know, ethnic communities. I'm going to get out of this view because I just really quickly, I don't know, do we have access to the internet or should I just skip that? Yeah, just to show you really quickly, I think I should be able to open hyperlink. Maybe. Maybe it's not happening. Yeah. Sorry. Anyway, we did a map. We produced a map which kind of tells you. Oh, there it is. Sorry. It's a little bit slow. Anyway.
Yeah, continue.
I'll continue. Yeah, because this is the so. Now, I don't know if you're familiar, but Corporate Watch has produced a report, if you're interested in finding more statistics around this, which is called Snitches, Stinks and Leaks and How Immigration Raids Work. And they actually, they were able, part of the legislation requires enforcement officers and immigration raids have to be intelligence-led. Now, intelligence-led isn't really what is guiding those raids. So what they found out, there was a leaked information from 2014 Operation Centurion, which was when the majority of these raids happened. And it showed that the bulk of initial intelligence came from around 50,000 allegations per year from members of the public. Now that is not, to be able to go and get a warrant from a court, you need to have much harder evidence. So most of those tips offs that actually led to raids were classed in their own reports as great uncorroborated information from untested sources. So, there is an independent chief inspector of borders and immigration, and he produced a few damning reports about the way that the immigration raids take place. And he found that officers had warrants in only 43% of the raids, which is less than 50% of the total raids. So that again, that kind of really reveals the concerns that we had that there's going to be racial profiling and that would be ethnic communities would be targeted is pretty accurate, and it's happening. So now, are you familiar with the new requirement for landlords to run a right to rent check? Are any of you familiar with this? Okay. Again. New sanctions. The whole immigration issue, irregular migration, has been criminalized, and anyone who's linked as a provider of particular service is also criminalized now. So for landlords, there is up to 5 years in prison for landlords who have not followed the right check procedure, and I think. There's also a fine attached, but I can't remember exactly what this amount is. So this was introduced, the right to rent check was introduced with the Immigration Act of 2014. And they run a pilot program up in the West Midlands, in 5 different boroughs of the West Midlands. Now the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants did an evaluation of that pilot scheme, and they found that 42% of the landlords were unlikely to rent to people without British passports. Yeah, not everyone has British passports. A lot of people haven't got an ID. People who are British citizens haven't got a passport. So, and a lot of British citizens don't necessarily speak English with a standard English accent, or they don't have a name that sounds very British, very English rather, not British. So you can imagine if 42% of landlords are unlikely to rent to people without British passports, what the knock-on effect that has on communities that actually do have a right to be here. Over 25% of landlords were less likely to rent to those with a foreign name or accent, and 77% of landlords did not support the scheme for good reasons. Immigration legislation is very, very complicated, even for legal professionals. I struggle to understand all the different kinds of things that you can do or you can't do. So it's very unpopular publicly, and evidence shows that, for example, 66% of irregular migrants do not go through the private market. They kind of, they stay with friends, or they kind of use underground channels to be able to find a room. Now that, I don't know how many of you are familiar with some cases where the beds for sheds. So people are really, vulnerable irregular migrants who have got an irregular status and are being abused at workplaces. They work, you were talking about £6.50 per hour. That doesn't, 50 euros per hour, which in British terms is even less than that. Nobody can live in this, for this amount of money, let alone send money to the family back home, or do any of those things that kind of drive people to leave their home place to begin with. So, the restrictive immigration, what it's doing is it's creating this underclass of people that has no protection. Human rights. Everyone has human rights. Well, this legislation completely strips you from any human rights. And often, people of uncertain status, not because they don't have the right to be here, but because perhaps, their visa has expired and are in the process of waiting for a renewal. The right to rent check isn't bulletproof. It's just a bureaucratic process that can go wrong and does go wrong in many, many cases. Oh, yeah, okay, so there we are. Next thing, health, Home Office accessing thousands of people's NHS data to trace irregular migrants. The Home Office made 725 requests for records in the first 3 months of 2014, rising to 1,289 for the same period, so 84% higher than the year before, and to 2,367 in the first 3 months of 2016, which is a threefold increase in over 2 years, 255% rise than in 2014. Now, medical records are generally protected by strong data protection laws. And I don't know how many people are familiar that actually, the Home Office can and does get the data from the health service. They don't have the medical details, but they know which services you've accessed, where you live, so the raid regime can then be enforced more strongly, even though it's not quite legal or ethical going about it in this way. Many doctors, many doctors are against these regulations, and the last week they threatened they don't want to be checking people's IDs before they give them, before they provide a service that they see as a public service and a matter of public health issue. So they threaten that they will take action. So if they do, I think we should join them. And then, again, driving licenses and bans. The Immigration Act of 2014 enforced 3 new measures to refuse new applications for a UK driving license, to revoke existing licenses, and to open a new bank account you have to you have to be able to produce those papers. And as I said, sometimes people that do have the right to be here, but because they're in between some bureaucratic process to renew their visas, who fall within these disqualified person categories by mistake, you know, feel they can't access bank. I mean, what can you do in London if you can't have a bank account? Pretty much very little. You can't get paid, you can't do any financial transactions. I mean, you are at the mercy of people that will take advantage of, you know, these shortages. So I won't go through because so I think, you know, our director, whose name is Don Flynn, he says that the hostile environment is an insidious virus that is creeping into workplaces as a consequence of this immigration act. A determination to stand up for the rights of migrants is the antidote needed to counter its worst effects. So I would like to call all of you to, you know, join whatever campaigns you kind of come across that support migrants' rights. I don't know if any of you, you know, if many of you or if some of you are migrants yourselves. I think there is a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen to in London, a third of the population is born out of the UK. A huge percentage of this is, I think it's about 800,000 who come from the EU. You know, in the post-Brexit context, we don't know what's going to happen when this Article 50 will be invoked. Everyone is under threat, pretty much. Everyone who's not British is under threat. There is an action, actually, that I would like to hand out some flyers. It's a really gentle one. It's not, and it's called One Day Without Us. Are you familiar with this? Yeah. So anyone who's a migrant, we are going to strike for one day, just to kind of see will they miss us.
What's the date of that?
That is in February, on the 20th of February. So if you can, you know, walk out from anything, work, education, I will encourage you to join. Keep an eye on our website. We do publish a lot of news about different campaigns and events and other things that take place across the UK, not just in London. Okay, so thank you very much.